ENC por 4 años. Voy a dar el disclaimer de que estas charlas son en inglés, van a ser las dos en inglés, vamos a grabarlas, las preguntas luego van a ser, se pueden hacer, las puedo traducir, puedo ayudar a traducirlas, así que voy a hacer una breve introducción para que nuestros invitados también puedan entender, pero para que estén bien atentos y cualquier cosa también me pueden preguntar, o a Rodrigo, o a Estefan, o a Fabio, que también hablan muy bien inglés. So, welcome everyone to this international seminar. Here we have the pleasure to have two international experts in conservation planning. We have Jennifer McGowan first. She's Chief Scientist of Untamed Planet, and also she was a Global Scientist of TNC for 5 years. She's currently Global Managing Director of Markson Software, Associate Researcher of Yale University, and Associate Researcher of University of Queensland. She is an expert with several years of training people around the world on conservation planning, and she has many papers, many scientific papers. So Jenny, you're welcome to come.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes. It's okay? Perfect. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work I was doing at the Nature Conservancy. I was in the global science team and supporting what we call our blue bonds strategy, but really what it is sovereign debt restructuring for ocean conservation. So some of what I will talk about is a little bit of science, but mostly a story of how we try to inform better decision making and some of the lessons that we learned along the way. So what I'll talk about first is some of the work we did for this paper, which was published in Conservation Biology back in 2019. But basically, if you're not familiar with sovereign debt restructuring, sometimes these are called debt swaps. I believe Chile had a few of these in the 90s. So this is not something that's particularly new. These have been around for a very long time, and basically what it is when countries have a lot of debt, you can renegotiate and restructure that debt. Sometimes it's for climate, sometimes it's for social equity. We have been trying to do it at the Nature Conservancy now for ocean conservation. So how can we leverage more money into ocean conservation? There's some key steps. This is the Nature Conservancy's diagram, but basically we have to negotiate. Now, that looks like it might be simple, but it's actually very complicated. So the negotiation has many stakeholders, many layers, from ministers of finance to the ministers of environment and presidents, local nonprofits, multilateral banks, whoever owns the money. So some of these are on private markets, financiers, you have to have political risk insurance. So these are very complicated transactions. And so the negotiation can take a very long time, and it can be very unpredictable. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Then the conditions of the negotiations are typically that the governments will embark on an inclusive, locally led marine spatial planning process to help countries achieve 30 by 30 for their oceans. And what we did is we have several years of very specific milestones that become part of the transaction as a way to manage the progress and ensure that the money is being spent and delivering the outcomes that we want. And so I worked on what this process looked like for the Belize debt swap. And then we do supporting conservation work. Effectively, that is from the money that has been restructured and saved. That money can either go into the government to help support conservation, but the majority goes into a conservation trust fund. And that trust fund has a non-government majority of people from within the country, hopefully within the country, and they have a board that decides on how the money is spent. So the NGOs like the Nature Conservancy can influence how money is spent, but it's really meant to be driven by the countries. Okay, so in Belize, we finished this deal. The first one that we did was in the Seychelles, and that was the first time this financial mechanism has been used for ocean conservation. So it was pretty interesting. It did a lot of fisheries. It resulted in some ocean planning. In Belize, what we ended up working with was $553 million of government debt that was restructured. And ultimately, what that does is it averages around 4.2 million annually for conservation. So sometimes it can really improve the fiscal space for conservation, which isn't always the top priority for governments, particularly coming out of COVID. It's hard to make space for nature at the table when you're trying to rebuild economies and you're focused on human health. So this is a really interesting way to leverage money and commitment into ocean conservation. So Hugh was asked by the former president, CEO of the Nature Conservancy, to come up with a structured and transparent way of helping the Nature Conservancy prioritize where we can do these transactions. So very complicated transactions. So we started thinking about, well, what are all of the different factors that might influence a decision? So certainly there's, conditions of the debt. Is it the right kind of debt? How much is there available to purchase? What's the credit ranking? So some of these are economic factors that we might consider. Certainly the cost of doing conservation, who is this going to affect and how can we incorporate that in our decision making? What's the likelihood it will work, right? A lot of these things are really dependent on the presidents and political schedules. So we could negotiate the perfect deal and then there's an election and whoever we've been working with is replaced. And they don't want to take on the legacy of the previous administration. So the time to election is sometimes a factor to think about. Reputational risk and corruption factors, are we going to do a debt swap with Somalia? Things to be thinking about. Who are the partners on the ground that can do the work and what's our relationship with governments? So these are just some of the factors that we might start to think about. Which is basically where we start, right? When we're starting with the structured decision-making process, we want to start thinking about all of the different attributes that might affect our decision. There's a lot of different approaches you can use to then help you prioritize. This is something that Hugh and I will be teaching next week. But there's a lot of different approaches. You can do some scoring approaches. We'll have a look at that. Cost-benefit analysis, cost-utility analysis, multi-criteria decision analysis. I'm not going to go through all of these, but we ended up settling on cost effectiveness for this framework because really why cost effectiveness is a good approach is because you can have a non-monetary benefit function, right? So we can be thinking about area of mangroves or numbers of people, right? We can define benefits in different ways that don't have to be converted into a dollar value. So I'll just walk you through, this is a Latin American example. This is illustrative, so these are not reflective of the truth, okay? But this was one of the approaches when Hugh and I started asking around and thinking about how the Nature Conservancy and other partners were looking at prioritizing where they can work. This is not unique to the Nature Conservancy. This type of approach is used all over the world, very, very common. It's a scoring approach. So let's look and see what some of these interesting things are. So they had come together and realized, all right, there's some deal parameters, some attributes that we want to look at. And so they were scoring everything on a score of 0 to 5. So whoever the experts were that were making this, let's say, decided that Ecuador has a lot of debt and Belize has a lot of debt, but there's really not that much debt available in some of these other countries. Pretty important if the mechanism or the action is actually a debt restructuring. So debt is pretty important. They put some attributes for conservation. So what's our ability to improve marine spatial planning in a country? What is the biodiversity impact? That is not well defined in this table. And then the capacity of the teams on the ground. So what is our ability to actually work and do these deals? You do need a functioning team on the ground. What's our partnering capacity and safety for staff? So these were the attributes they were thinking of, and they gave them all some scores between 0 and 5 based on some expert opinion. And what they ended up doing was they scored them all, and then they took the average, and they ended up with this ranking. So we end up with the ranking here, which effectively says, well, Ecuador and Belize are the top priorities based on this approach. But if we look closely across this attribute row, there's very little ability to improve MSP, which is really fundamental to the success of this deal. So by giving this a 0 score and then averaging it, we still end up with a country that might not be the top for what we're trying to do. And the third highest priority here is Mexico, but there's actually no debt to purchase there. So this is to illustrate that when we take factors and we turn them into numbers like 0 to 5, and we add them up and average them and create a priority list from that, we are probably not getting the best return on investment for what we're doing. So it's a convoluted way of structuring a decision. So the other approach that people use is they like to say, well, let's multiply them. So in this case, let's add them up and then let's multiply them. And so then we get a new score over here from the multiplied approach. And we find that Ecuador and Guatemala are really the only two that would emerge in a list for results, right? Because we have so many zeros in this list that these are the only two that are available. But interestingly here, a lot of these factors that are zeros are things that we can invest in. They're things that we can invest in to change, to bring them away from 0 and up towards a different score. So to rule them out in this approach and just say, well, Ecuador and Guatemala are the two places we should work, is again, it's a less than perfect way to be guiding decisions. And so I just want to make the point that this is how many, many decisions are made around the world. Right? This is not new. Lots of people score things and add them up. And it's not to say that they're wrong necessarily, but you should be very wary if you are looking at a prioritization that has been the result of something that is used in an approach like this. And we've all done this, and I think we've all seen this before, and we've all even been guilty of it in the past. So what we did is we selected a prioritization, we developed a prioritization protocol where rather than taking all these different factors that have different meanings and adding them up, let's try to structure it. So some of these factors are actually, can we do a deal or not, right? So what are those? And illustrating what those are is important, being articulate. Is there debt to purchase? Does TNC even work there? Can we secure low-cost credit enhancement? Things that are related to just the technical ability to do a deal. Then we built a scenario construction where we used a cost-effectiveness framework, which I'll go through. And in the end, what we get is a ranked list of countries. So what I'll do is quickly walk through some of the interesting things that we did in the cost-effectiveness analysis. And so what we wanted to look at was really defining the problem context in relation to what is the action that countries are going to be taking and what's the expected benefit of that action. Now, our oceans have obviously lots of different pressures and threats affecting them. Some of them are, fishing threats. Some of them are land-based threats like coastal development or nutrient pollution. We have sea level rise. There's catastrophic events that are unpredictable. So we used some of this information from Ben Halpern, which is a cumulative effects, framework for understanding different pressures. And there's a lot of actions we can take, right? We can build MPAs, we can restore coastal ecosystems, we can invest our money in training people, in education, in community engagement. The action that we're really looking at here in this strategy is establishing marine protected areas, right? So we want to help countries get to 30% area-based conservation through either protected areas or OECMs, which is the newer mechanism. So what we did is we wanted to look at the action of establishing area-based protection in relation to the different pressures and threats that are going to be impacted by that action. So if we're thinking about marine protected areas, one of the pressures that we're actually influencing is fishing, right? We're either improving fishing or we are moving it somewhere else or we're improving management. And a lot of these are not going to be addressed or abated by marine protected areas. Right? So just looking at these pressures and saying, well, if we're putting MPAs in, we're not actually tackling coastal development. So those pressures are going to continue to persist, even if we do a marine spatial plan, if we're not addressing land-based threats. And so what we did is we pulled this out a little bit, and we said, well, what are those abatable and unabatable threats that are going to be tackled by the action being a marine protected area. And then we brought that into the benefit function. So we're actually saying our benefit is going to be impacted by these different pressures in different ways, whether they're stopped or whether they persist. And so we just added in a little threat-based counterfactual into the benefit function of a cost-effectiveness analysis. And it's very simple, but surprisingly, it's not done very often. And it does have some interesting results. So for example, how this might play out is, let's say we have a patch, three different patches of coral reefs. In many, many plans around the world, what I see still to this day is people might look at a map of where their features are, where the things that they care about are, and then they overlay it with a map of threat. And then they say, well, let's avoid those places that are under high threat. And so we end up maybe with a priority ranking of the coral reefs that looks something like this, where this, big area in a low threat area becomes our top priority, and we ignore this coral reef that's down in the bottom because there's a lot of pressures there. So if we walk it through our little framework, then we think about abatable pressures, and then we think about our unabatable pressures, we end up with a very different result. And so here, again, multiplying the benefit, which is area of coral reef, by these different abatable and unabatable pressures, we end up with a different prioritization. Right? So how we start thinking about bringing this information into our decision-making matters, and the cost-effectiveness framework is a really nice way of doing it. This isn't sophisticated. We're not looking at complex interactions here, I will say that. We're making some very simple assumptions, lots to be improved, but as we think about science advancing to address more cumulative pressures, synergies, antagonistic effects are really important. The literature is starting to address this, and you can bring that in over time. So all to say, very simple framework. Let's think about factors that basically say we can't do a deal. Let's look at some cost-effectiveness analysis that thinks about threats that are abatable and unabatable in these oceans. And let's come up with a ranked list. So we did that. This is just an example from Africa. And then what we wanted to do was look and see how, if we didn't factor in threats, what that list would look like, and then how sensitive our results are. So countries might move up and down the list depending on how the abatable threats and unabatable threats play out. So this is what we presented, and basically wasn't adopted. It was too sciencey. We then had to take it to the decision makers, to the strategy leads, and they had their own way of doing things. And so this is where the story comes in, right? So that's a little bit of the science, and now this is the story, which is how do we as scientists and structured decision makers try and influence decisions at the highest level of strategy? And it's actually quite difficult, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned. So for a variety of reasons, this approach was not really well adopted. It was too scientific. It was too scientific. Even that simple framework was too scientific. Potentially that could have been because champions of our framework left the organization. Potentially it could be because scientists are not necessarily considered strategy directors, and so we're often not at the table as strategies get shaped. And so some of this is just a fight. It's a fight and it's a negotiation, and you have to be incredibly persistent and say, look, what we're doing is going to help you make a better, more informed decision. So now I'll talk about what happened after that. So there's been some research done on just trying, institutional barriers. I think that these are very, very common. We have scarce resources. We need to be spending that money on doing things, not on building better decisions. Prioritization is really only useful when we're doing simple decisions, not something complicated like a debt transaction. Often you'll hear that we don't have enough available data to make a good decision. And prioritization often means giving up on some goals. Right? And that can be quite confronting for strategy leads. A lot of the things that I hear is typically, doing a structured decision process will take too long. Right? We needed answers yesterday. We don't have time for you to think about this and build a new framework for us to make decisions. Aren't you overcomplicating this? Right? You're trying to science something that doesn't really need to be scienced. And it feels like you're really turning this into a science project. We can make decisions. It's pretty hard to come up with a counter narrative to this, right? Especially as a scientist, we tend to be maybe less empowered in our organizations and institutions. So what ultimately happened was after 2.5 years of not having a structured process, for how we were engaging in scoping of these transactions. They were being quite opportunistic at the time, largely being driven by, do we have a friend in the Ministry of Finance? Because that is, in the end, the entry point, right? If we can't get the finance minister on the line to show him what a debt swap is and what it can do, then there's no point. So, fair enough. But eventually, as the strategy started to grow and we started coming under capacity constraints, we can't scope 20 countries in the world, we're a small team. Somebody from NatureVest, which is the finance and impact investing arm of the Nature Conservancy, asked the very relevant question, which is, how are you making decisions? And at that point, I became very popular, right? So no one wanted to talk to me in the beginning, and then all of a sudden, because someone asked the question, it was go talk to Jennifer. She's got a whole structured process already ready to go. So at that point, what I was able to do is compile a team from the inside with the buy-in of the strategy directors. We eliminated a lot of the science work that we did, but we came up with a process that I think worked for everybody. And so we had someone from policy, someone from the regions, we had representation from the finance team, from the science team, and the marine spatial planning team. And we came up with this new framework that has a screening stage, which is based similarly on those enabling criteria, some opportunity mapping, a long list review where then you really have to go in and talk to the regions. And sometimes our country programs really just didn't want to engage in this. It's a lot of work, and they're very busy. So bringing it in more integrated vertically across the organization. So in the end, this is some of the results. So we have a no-go stage, which is basically, let's start with everywhere in the world and start filtering out countries that don't have oceans. Let's look at conditions of credit ranking. Let's think about political risk. But interestingly, in this collaborative framework, the policy team was really convinced that even if there is corruption in countries, if we have a strong team on the ground there, that can overcome it. And so we ended up doing some combination of, yes, it might be corrupt, but if we have a team, it stays in the framework, and then other things. And what I will say is, instead of this ranked list or this cost effectiveness analysis and the results, this was the game-changing graphic that I made. So I was able to present this to the strategy leaders. It's a very simple plot. I mean, it looks pretty, and it makes sense to them. So they can look and say, all right, feasibility times opportunity. This changed everything. They loved this. So we have some different actions that you might consider depending on where your country might land. But ultimately, what I did was I plotted then all of the countries that we were scoping based on opportunism and who had a friend in the ministry ended up in this bottom quartile. And that was the aha moment for the strategy leads and the leadership of the organization, because they saw chasing opportunities will only get you so far, and we're missing out on all of these really incredible opportunities for impact. So that little simple diagram is what ultimately did change everything. And all of a sudden, decision science was embraced, and this is a framework that is now being used. And they loved this. You can do different things. Importantly, when we think about conservation opportunity, we have a lot of small countries that debt swaps could help. They're not going to compete with larger countries, right? So Caribbean countries in particular end up ranking quite low on the opportunity because this is an area-based strategy. And so what we wanted to make sure was that if it's high likelihood, if the debt is there, but they're not ranking high on opportunity, we don't eliminate them, right? We want to be thinking about them, but we want to be looking at alternate benefits. So not just area-based benefits for 30%. Right, so in the end, there's different things that you can do. You might want to evaluate these down the back end, but it leads into different steps, and then basically the analysis goes to different teams. And ultimately, that's how we are now, the Nature Conservancy is still doing their scoping. So just a couple of things to be mindful of, when we think about decision-making and biases and decision-making, this is going to be common to everything we do as scientists who are trying to inform decisions, management decisions, policy, sunk costs, right? Sometimes we just keep investing in something because we've already invested in it. So we saw this a lot with some of the countries we had started to scope, even though it wouldn't necessarily be successful, they wanted to keep scoping it. These transactions, I would say a rough estimate, to do a debt swap, the transaction cost is probably around $10 million all told. So these are big investments that have an unlikely probability of success. So you want to be mindful of escalating costs, motivational bias. Oftentimes decisions are made just based on someone's personal value, especially strategy directors. They like a country or you like a species, so you just keep investing in that. Confirmation bias is where we often look for justification in our decisions, despite really thinking about a real theory of change. And they're not bad strategies. I think often what I have found is the idea of chasing opportunism in the early stages of a new strategy works because you want to get an early win. The danger is that decision makers get anchored in that opportunism, and there has to be a switching point where you say, great, we've done our proof of concept. We know that this works. Now is the time to do something that's a lot more rigorous to ensure we can really get high return on investment. And so the lessons that I learned in this process are really that, being patient, timing is really important and it's unpredictable. The work that we did, that Hugh and I did in those early days, even though it wasn't used, there was an opportunity later on for that to be resurrected. And it changed, but it was still very valuable because it anchored us in the process. Understand that asking people how they make their decisions is very, very confronting. It's very confronting. And most of the time as scientists, we are outsiders. And so for us to come in and ask people and look under the hood, we're going to be basically, I was telling Hugh this, like the hall monitor in school, right? Like no one wants to be the hall monitor because you become like the authority, the person giving out fines. Like no one wants to be told that they're doing it wrong. So you have to be very good at how you approach being a collaborator when you're trying to improve decision making. That's something I learned. Messages matter. I could have scienced that to death, but in the end, it was really just that pretty XY plot that changed everything. So figuring out how to communicate to your audience really matters, and often as scientists, we like to overcomplicate things. And in the end, decision support is just a translation of people's values. And so I try to not get too judgy about benefits or how values are being expressed. I just want people to be clear about what they are valuing because they have to be able to quantify it. And so I try to nudge, but oftentimes I see this as a translation process that we can inform by science, but science isn't really usually going to be the decision maker. So it's a delicate play between art and science and communication. And so that's what I've learned in this process. So there you go, lessons learned. Thank you. Some questions, I think, if we have a little bit of time, but.
We can take one or two questions. Podemos tomar una o dos preguntas y si quiere la hace en español y yo la puedo traducir. Así que, ¿una pregunta?
Estas deudas son con el Banco Mundial, ¿con qué tipo de instituciones finalmente estos países tienen estas potenciales deudas que se pueden intercambiar?
Good question here, Jan. These debts, which are the institutions that it's the World Bank? What institutions are these countries having these debts?
So the debt can be, usually these are kind of secondary market debts, and so it really depends. We're not in this strategy looking at bilateral debt, which is, government to government. So sometimes it is the Paris Club, right, is who the debt was restructured with through the Seychelles. So sometimes it's consortiums, sometimes it's multilateral banks. It depends on the financial evaluation of the debt, and that is the finance people do that, not me, but it could be a variety of things. And so what debt we want to target is a big conversation in the early scoping days.
¿Necesitas traducción? ¿No? Bueno, decía que depende pueden ser consorcios, pueden ser deudas multilaterales, realmente depende del país, ¿no? Depende del país con quien tienes estas deudas. ¿Ya? ¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Alguna otra pregunta de aquí de los colegas?
The one in the back.
In the back?
I noticed on a slide you mentioned extreme events as in unabatable and abatable. I was just curious, how would you incorporate that in the structured decision process, in particular thinking about nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction, which is obviously quite a hot topic here in Chile?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it can factor in a variety of ways if you want to think about cost effectiveness. So sometimes, this is the hard part as well, is a lot of the attributes that you can think about can factor into multiple places. So something can be a benefit, but it can also be a cost, and it can also be a likelihood of success. So I think one way to do it is to think about the likelihood of success given some likelihood of catastrophe. So we've done that in the past with coral reef bleaching, for example, floods and other things. You could think about the likelihood of success and relate that back to your benefit. In the unabatable pressures, though, I think it was more like less extreme events, but ocean acidification, kind of persistent and diffuse threats. But you could incorporate catastrophes or the likelihood of catastrophes. And they factor that also into the transactions with the parametric insurance on the deal, so that if it is highly likely that something comes through and destroys the coral reef, that some of the money on the insurance gets deployed right away. So there's a variety of ways that catastrophes factor into something like this, but I think if you wanted to, for me, I would probably target the probability of success parameters using some estimates of catastrophes from the past and predicted catastrophes.
Voy a resumir lo que entendí. Mi capacidad cognitiva es un poquito breve. Pero preguntó cómo las amenazas, cómo las catástrofes entran dentro de estos marcos, y ella podía decir, realmente depende de la probabilidad de éxito, pueden entrar como costos, pueden entrar como beneficios, pero realmente dependen de esta probabilidad de éxito que se tiene que ponderar o parametrizar, ¿no? Así, bien resumido. Gracias, Jen.
Thank you.
So, we have one more question.
¿Cómo manejan los posibles conflictos de interés entre quienes financian y quienes gobiernan o manejan los recursos? Y si existe...
Roberto was asking, how do you deal with conflict of interest from who funds it and who receives the funding? And
¿Cómo manejan el lobby que se puede dar en esa interacción?
And how do you deal with the lobby that can be resulted in that lobby interaction?
Yeah, so the first question was conflict of interest. Yeah, so really where that can factor in is through the Conservation Trust Fund being an independent board who is responsible for administering the money. So the way that some of them are structured is all of the money flows into the Conservation Trust Fund, partially into an endowment that cannot be touched for 20 years, partially into grants or however the trust fund wants to do it, and the government can apply for grants, but there's no guarantee because it's the trust fund who is deciding how the money is spent. Sometimes the negotiators, like the Nature Conservancy, will have a board seat on the Conservation Trust Fund, but it is meant to be non-government majority, and so in theory it should be independent. So that's how one of the conflict of interests. Do you want to translate or?
Do you want me? to translate? Lo último, dijo que hay una institución, eso, si no mis colegas acá, porque estaba medio desconcentrada, hay una institución como un fondo de conservación, como los land trust en conservación privada, que no sé cómo se traduce land trust en español, estaba preguntando, pero hay un organismo independiente que maneja los fondos y eso evita que, con eso se aborda el conflicto de interés.
And then the lobbying issue, I mean, I think there's a couple places where it could come into effect, but generally the ministers at this point are quite eager to restructure debt. And so lobbying against that, I don't know. I mean, it might affect whether or not we're willing to continue in the negotiation. That's one way.
Okay. So, can you say it like very briefly?
Mostly the ministers of finance are interested in restructuring debt, okay. And so they lobby the president effectively.
So, los ministros de finanzas, ellos reestructuran el tema de la deuda y entre ellos tienen que abordar el tema del lobby.
Yeah, so if the ministers of finance have been lobbied to not do this work, then we probably cannot do a transaction.
So, si los ministros de finanzas dicen que no se va a hacer el trabajo, no se hace la transacción.
And then the other place lobbying could come into play is in the marine spatial planning process, where industry and sectors will be involved in an inclusive MSP, but that's the nature of
Y el otro lugar donde puede ocurrir lobby es en la planificación espacial marina, donde hay otros actores, está la industria, hay otras organizaciones. Entonces, pero ahí es más difícil controlar el lobby por la diversidad de actores. Sí. He was thinking about the Chilean case. Yeah, but we'll have more time for questions. Thank you, Jen.
Okay, thank you very much.
Now I'm going to introduce Professor Hugh Possingham again, because probably maybe you forgot. But Professor Hugh Possingham, he has dedicated his life to conserving biodiversity. He told me to say that he's mainly a bird watcher since he was 10 years old. 10 years old, yeah. He's a professor at the University of Queensland. He was chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy. He was also ex-chief scientist of the Queensland government in Australia. He is an elected member of the US Academy of Science. He's also a member of the Australian Academy of Science. He has more than 750 publications. He's in many, many boards, more than 30, he said, at the moment. And he really likes birds. So, yeah.
Thanks, Maria. Thank you. Thank you for that. Oh, good. Thanks, my slides. Thanks, Barbara. Welcome everybody, and particularly I'd like to thank Maria and Barbara for organising our trip. So we're largely here to teach a course on decision science for conservation, and that'll be Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday next week. So we're teaching a course at Chilewa. And my background in that sense is very unusual. I was trained as a mathematician, but I love nature. And then I know a tiny amount of economics, not as much as Stefan, but this much economics. So I combine a little bit of maths and a little bit of ecology and a little bit of economics to help us make better conservation decisions. And of those 750 Web of Science papers, 600 are about decision science tools for conservation. One of our most successful tools that Jennifer and I have worked on a lot is called MarkSan. MarkSan builds protected area systems and has influenced the national park systems, the marine park systems, the land-based park systems in over 100 countries around the world. South Africa, United Kingdom, all through the United States, all the big non-government organisations, WWF, the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, Wildlife Conservation Society, and even down to local municipalities use MarkSan to help them prioritise spatial plans. So there's lots of parts to decision science and conservation, and Jennifer gave a good example of how decision science can be used in something where you wouldn't think it could be used, choosing countries to do a debt conversion. I'm going to talk about decision science for monitoring and research. This is my least popular talk. Most people hate this talk. This talk should upset some of you. Is anybody upset already? Is anybody a bit upset? And really I'm asking the question, you know, who here thinks they're a researcher? Who here does some form of research of some kind? Who's a researcher? Hopefully half of you are. Who thinks that monitoring is good? Do you think monitoring is good? Is that a good thing to do? Yeah. Sometimes, maybe, not always. So I'm going to challenge whether we should always be doing it, because if we talk to people in universities, if we talk to scientists and ecologists, the first thing they'll say is you should do more research and you need more data and you should do more monitoring, because if you don't do that, you can't make a decision. And often they're right. Often more data is always good. There's nothing bad about more data. Nothing bad about more data. But how much time and money should you spend on research? Because you could be spending that time and money on actually doing things. So who here thinks they're an applied scientist who actually delivers outcomes on the ground by doing things? Who's very applied? I'm a very applied scientist. Yeah. And then there's people who are very pure scientists, and that's fine as well, because we need all kinds of scientists. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to give you some examples of the role of decision science in helping us decide how much monitoring is enough, how much research is enough. And I'm going to start with a story about puffins. So this is a flying penguin, if you like. I think in the Northern Hemisphere they were very surprised to find penguins, like Australia and Chile has penguins. You have two common penguins here. Australia has some penguins. New Zealand has lots of penguins. Their penguins fly. And puffins are one of the most iconic species. And Europeans, the Scottish, the British, North Americans love puffins. They're one of the most iconic birds in the world, like a panda or a koala. I went to a conference about 15 years ago in Scotland, I think it was Aberdeen. Was it Aberdeen? St Andrews, somewhere there. About. Maybe it wasn't there, maybe it was there. And there were lots of talks about how they were going to develop a monitoring strategy to determine whether climate change was affecting puffins. So puffins tend to breed on little islands all around Scotland, and they were spending millions of pounds on designing a monitoring scheme to count the puffins to see, is climate change and global warming going to cause trouble for our puffins? So I listened to these talks. I was the plenary speaker at the conference. I listened to these talks over 2 days, and I gave to give my plenary talk at the end, and I said, why? I said, why? Why? What are you going to do? If climate change is causing the puffin food supply to decline and the puffins start disappearing from the islands, what are you going to do? Are you going to give the puffins a fridge, a refrigerator? Every puffin can get a fridge to sit by their burrow to keep them cool. Are you going to breed the fish that they eat and throw it into the ocean? There's a lot of ecology where people are studying the impact of climate change on species. A lot. Thousands of papers. And I say, why? Maybe in some cases you can move them. So anyway, I gave this talk and I talked about other things. And at the last night, there was a big dinner, and my wife and I were sitting at the dinner. It was in a golf club. Nobody was talking to me. And then after a while, they drank enough whiskey to come up and chat to me and said, Hugh, we're annoyed with you. We're angry because you're saying that all this science and all this very brilliant statistical analysis, power analysis, looking at type 2 errors, very clever analysis, you're saying it's useless. But we've decided it's not useless. And they said, if Scotland loses its puffins, then we need to tell Iceland and Greenland to look after their puffins. So that was the action. So, to my view, research and monitoring has to lead to a change of action. So, yes, they had an action. We'll tell the Icelanders and the Greenlanders that they need to look after their puffins. And I said, why not tell them now? We think our puffins are stuffed. You know, our puffins are disappearing. We really think that you should look after yours and we'll help you do that. So, sometimes if the action costs nothing to do, or almost nothing to do, you don't need science to do it, you just go and do it. There's even if there's just a small risk that the puffins are disappearing, write to Greenland, write to Iceland, and tell them that they should look after the puffins. So they still were angry with me, and they've never invited me back. There you go. So I ask these questions all the time. Now, Chile, you've got whales going up and down the coast, presumably. Is it humpback whales? Humpback whales. Do you count the whales? Do you count them a lot? So, and in Australia, the whales, we count them every year, the humpback whales. And do you know what? Ever since we started killing whales, they've been increasing at 10% per year every year. It's a perfect exponential growth curve. And we keep counting them. And it costs them $2 or $3 million a year to count the whales. Why are we counting the whales? Why are you counting your whales? Are they going up? Does anybody know what's happening to the humpback whales? Assume they're going up. Ours are going up really quickly. $2 or $3 million a year. And I said, are you counting them so that you can open up your whaling industry again and start killing whales for skirts and oil? That's what you kill whales for, right? Of course, nobody in Australia is ever going to kill another whale. Nobody in Chile is ever going to kill another whale, are they? Why are you counting them? $2-3 million a year of counting whales. And they said, well, the minister often is asked, how are the politicians are asked, how are the whales going? So they need to have an answer. Is that enough of a reason to spend $2 or $3 million counting whales? Okay, so I can give you lots and lots of examples of people doing research. Jennifer and I have a nice paper. A lot of wildlife biologists love to catch things, birds and mammals and seals, and they catch them and they tag them and they track them all over the place and say, look, this is where they go. And I say, why do you want to know that? Well, sometimes they have a good reason, but sometimes they don't know. They just say, we need to know where they go to conserve them. And then I continually also again say, why? So we have a long paper about that. So after a while, I thought, well, there are reasons to monitor and do research, and I wanted to classify them so I could organise them in my head so that we did know why we were doing them. So, for example, let's go some good reasons to, if you're doing a conservation intervention and you'll say improving groundwater, getting farmers to use less groundwater, or you're doing some restoration and you're being given money to do that, then you need to monitor to see if it worked. You need to monitor to see if that's good. That's a good reason to monitor. In fisheries, often you have a quota, and then people might be counting bycatch of dolphins and seabirds, and if they exceed the bycatch, the fishery stops. That's good monitoring, because the monitoring leads to an action. Monitoring leads to an action. Often we need to make decisions. We need to make decisions about interventions for species and ecosystems. So we need better models, so we need to build more science, we need to gather more data about where a species is to know how to protect it. If you have a rare and threatened species and you don't know anywhere where it is, then clearly you need to learn more about those things. Probably my favourite is this. This is what academics have been talking about for years, active adaptive management, and that is where you actually monitor interventions. So you act in different ways for the species in different places. It's active adaptive management, and you have to monitor that, and then you try and work out which intervention is the best intervention. Should I be putting up nest boxes? Should I be killing an invasive weed? Should I be changing the amount of water that goes down a stream? And then sometimes you just need pure science. Now I'm not going to talk about this. Pure science is good because you never know what's going to be useful. If you looked at, say, cryptology, the mathematics of the banking system, that was all pure mathematics, and everybody thought it was a silly waste of time, number theory, and those people now have made us billions and billions of dollars, cryptology. So you never know. So it's not bad. It's just in the world of conservation, how much pure science can we do when we're probably going to lose half the species in the planet in the next 200 years? How much basic science can we do? And then sometimes people doing monitoring learn a lot, which is good. Sometimes the public just want to know. So this is the whale situation. The public just keep asking the question, how are the whales? And they pay the taxes, so they should have an answer. And then, of course, many times we monitor things, like a lot of the bird monitoring. I'm a big eBird person. eBird's very popular in Chile. You have thousands of people entering eBird list. That data can be analysed from citizen scientists, and you can see patterns in it. And sometimes those patterns, you get unexpected results. But I suppose what I wanted to do is make it really very clear there are outcomes from these things, but many people start monitoring and they don't know which ones of these they're doing. So I suppose my first message is there's lots of reasons to do monitoring and research, but be very clear what's going to happen after you do it. Or what, in TN's, the Nature Conservancy, what is your theory of change? What is your theory of change? And then the second question, though, is if you can explain why you're doing the monitoring and research, how much money should you spend on the monitoring and research? And this is called value of information theory, because you could have a conservation budget, you could be working for World Wildlife Fund, and you've given some money to work on a fox or a goose or a swan. Do you want to spend all your money on research and monitoring, or do you want to spend some of your money acting on the ground? And that question can only be answered with value of information theory. And we have a number of, it's not a big field in conservation science yet. It actually helps you decide how much of your money you should spend on gathering knowledge. So I'm going to give you a generic example, a very generic example. Okay. So let's say we're looking after, does anybody here like plants, rare plants? Nobody? Yes, good. Okay, so I'll direct this to you. Let's say you're looking after a rare plant. Chile has, 1,000 species of endemic plants, many of which are rare and threatened. And you're looking at managing invasive weeds around that rare plant, and you've got a herbicide that you're going to use. And you've decided that this strategy, in controlling invasive species strategy, the benefit, that is how much it improves the viability of the plant, so your outcome is this plant going to persist for the next 100 years? You've done some modelling and you've worked out that the benefit depends on something you don't know much about. So in plants, it's often like a classic one would be seed dormancy. How long does a seed sit in the ground before it germinates? And that can be 2 years, 5 years, for some species it can be 20 years. Under what circumstances? So there's something you don't know. I don't know. And this strategy does better if seed dormancy is high, and it does worse if seed dormancy is low. So that's good. But at this point in time, if I've only got one thing I can do I need to know, I don't know what this parameter is. I think it's here, but it could be there and it could be there. I don't know what it is. It does affect my outcome. It does affect my outcome. But if I've only got one thing to do, what should I do? One thing. For many things, for many species, there's only one option on the table. Go and do it. Okay, so that's not very interesting. What's interesting, though, is often I might come up with another strategy, a different way of saving this species. I might have another kind of weed control mechanism. And to be honest, if that strategy is better than that strategy, for every unknown parameter of this, every value of this unknown parameter, I don't care about seed dormancy, do I? Because strategy B always delivers a better outcome than strategy A. Do I need to do science? Science is going to resolve this and make this smaller, and my uncertainty is going to contract. Do I need any science to decide what to do? No. So that's the most important thing I'm going to say. Scientists hate uncertainty and they want to reduce it, and they say this parameter, this thing affects your outcome, and I say I don't care. I don't care because I want to save the species, and the best thing to do, it doesn't matter what that parameter is. So this is probably the most important thing where you can always ask anybody who says we need to do more studies of this threatened species or this ecosystem. You need to say, prove to me it will change what we do. Prove to me it will change what we do. If they can't prove it, don't give them any money. They can do it on their own time. Of course, it's much more interesting if strategy B is better. This is what we think the number is, and they're both about good. But if the parameter is high, strategy B is better. If the parameter strategy B is better. If the parameter is high, strategy A is better. So under this case, knowing if seed dormancy is high or low would change what I do. But also, what am I doing now? I'm saying the change in benefit would be tiny. Should I spend $1 million tightening up this distribution and find out I'm here or there, when the actual benefit from changing strategy is tiny? I could have put the $1 million into doing more of one of these. So you don't have to you have to prove that the science will change the strategy, and the gains will outweigh the benefits of just spending all that monitoring and research money on doing more of the activity. Just plant more trees, kill more weeds, don't do any more science. And of course, there is one circumstance when the science does matter. Here, there's a huge difference in the benefit of the strategy. So I have to do the science. And the benefit of the science does more for conservation than doing more conservation. The science does more for the species than doing more management. How often do you see people prove this in conservation? Not often. They don't want to know about this graph. Okay, so when we start talking to people about an endangered species or an endangered ecosystem or protected areas or water management, we should always ask, they say you need to understand the system more. You need more models, you need more data, you need more distribution data. The first thing you say is, do you actually even have any options? If you don't have any options, you don't need any more data. Then you ask the question, what's the chance the research and the monitoring will change what you do? And then if they say yes, then you say, is the change going to be big enough to make a real difference? Or is it just going to be a tiny change? Okay. And why don't we take that monitoring and research data and put it into actual doing management? So you can see why maybe scientists don't like this bit of the talk. Another way of thinking it then is some monitoring is always, and science is always, a little bit's good. The question then would be how much do we need to do? How much would we need to do? So let's say you've been put in charge of a threatened species, or you've been put in charge of a wetland, and you've got a budget. You've got $200,000 a year. You could spend all your money on monitoring and research, or you could spend all your money on management, or you could spend half on each. What should you do? Well, it's clearly spending all your money on monitoring isn't a smart thing to do. So you've got to do some management. So let's say the good thing about spending more money on monitoring is we're going to assume that our management is better. So there's a relationship between knowledge and the efficiency of the management. So we're going to say scientists and monitoring delivers more efficient management. But the more money, the smarter you get and the better you manage, the amount of money to manage goes down. So if we multiply them together, all you have to do is multiply this by this, and you get that. That's the relationship between the monitoring, fraction of money you spend on monitoring, and your outcome. And this is the sweet spot. So this would say, if that was the relationship, the optimal budget on research and monitoring is 10%. So in theory, we could do this for any particular problem. I don't think it's rarely ever done. And in fact, it's funny, when you talk to we both work for Nature Conservancy, there's probably people here from different not-for-profit organisations, conservation organisations. You often ask the question, how much of our annual budget should we spend on monitoring and research? And what's the answer? I have no idea. It's not 100%, and it's probably not 0%, but what does this curve look like? What does that curve look like? And how can we understand what that curve is? Strangely enough, often we talk to most of these organisations like the Nature Conservancy, 10% of the staff were scientists. So probably 5 to 10% of our money was spent on science and research. Is that the right amount? If you talk to a big company like Coca-Cola, other places, they'll often be spending 10 to 20% of their money on research. A big chemical company, often spending, medical company, 10 to 20%, but some spend virtually nothing on research. Do we know what that is in conservation? Well, it all depends on the problem. I think I've said most of those things. And what is the time? Yes, good. Now I actually need to know the time. I'm monitoring now. Oh, I'm actually gathering data. Good. 12:16. Okay. Yeah, I won't go through that example because it gives me a headache. I'm going to give you another odd example, and it's all about type 1 and type 2 errors. Now, is anybody getting tremors and feeling sick? Because do you remember being taught about type 1 and type 2 errors in science? And the first time you heard it, you had no understanding, and about the 10th time you finally started to understand what they were talking about. So this is one of the most traumatic parts of statistics. So what is a type 1 error? Well, let me explain it with an example. So let's imagine we're in Australia and we're asking the question, does logging of forests, cutting down forests, does it have an impact on koalas? Or you could ask the same question, does logging your Valdivian forest have an impact on one of my favourite birds that I've never seen, the Magellanic woodpecker? What's that in Chilean? What's a Magellanic woodpecker? What's its Chilean name? That's right. So does logging have an impact on this bird? So you could, what we see in Australia, the forestry companies, they say, well, let's have a null hypothesis. And the null hypothesis is logging does not impact capitero. Is that the word? Capitero. I'm going to say woodpecker. Logging does not impact woodpeckers. That's what a good scientist does, right? A null hypothesis. Nothing's happening. So they go out and they set up a program and they monitor forests that aren't logged, and they monitor log forests, and they get a bit of data. And what do? They say, well, the type 1 error has to be 5%. So what is a type 1 error? That's the chance you say logging is having an impact, but it really isn't. So that's an error, and we're going to make that 5%. The other kind of error you can make in statistics is that logging is having an impact. Cutting trees down is having an impact on woodpeckers, so it's having an impact, but in fact, so you say, no, get right. This is why it gets confusing. Type 1 error is you reject the null hypothesis and say there is an impact when there wasn't really. A type 2 error is where you say there is no impact, we can't reject the null hypothesis, but in fact logging is impacting woodpeckers. What is the type 1 error is always set at 5%, isn't it? 5%. What's type 2 errors in most ecological studies? 50%. Sometimes it's 80%. So there's an enormous bias into not rejecting a null hypothesis. Enormous bias, because ecological field studies cost a lot of money. So if you look at that sort of thing, the first question you then say is, the whole process of setting a null hypothesis is fundamentally flawed, because we do these studies and we find that in fact logging hardly ever affects anything because we don't have enough data, and therefore we say logging is fine. Why not, in fact, why set type 1 errors at 5%? Who made that rule? Why is statistical significance 5%? And why are these numbers so much worse? So what we're doing is we're biasing it for not rejecting the null hypothesis. So we have written a paper, and other people have pointed this out. What we should really do is make these errors the same. At least, in fact. So you could really do a system, say, well, they should be both 30%. So you're equally likely to make the mistake of stopping the logging because it's not having an impact, that's a mistake, or not stopping the logging when it does have an impact. That's a mistake. There's two kinds of mistakes, and we should make them equal. But in fact, that's not even true either, because then the question is, what is the value to society from trees, and what's the value to society from woodpeckers? And maybe woodpeckers are more important than trees and wood. Maybe wood is more important than woodpeckers. So we should actually value forestry, and we should value woodpeckers, and we should set the type 1, 2 and type 1 and 2 errors in proportion to the value of the mistakes we could make. In proportion to the values of the mistakes we make. And nobody ever does that. So I suppose what I'm saying, if you're going to do monitoring and research, then be very careful about how you pick a null hypothesis, null hypothesis, because in fact at least they should be equal. And furthermore, when we did a case study of this, which was on koalas and logging, the monitoring program to get the type 2 error low enough was so expensive, you may as well just pay out the loggers and not do the logging. So we would have had to spend $10, $20 million to do enough monitoring to prove logging affects koalas. Just pay the money to stop the loggers logging. Don't do the science. Stop the logging. Because one thing I've sort of noticed, if you're talking about woodpeckers and koalas, what do woodpeckers do? They sort of live on trees, right? And if you chop them down, the null hypothesis in fact is insanity. The null hypothesis is insanity. The chance that chopping trees down has no effect on woodpeckers doesn't exist. I mean, they clearly have an effect on woodpeckers. So one of our biggest problems, I suppose, is when we train our students in ecology and science, we train them in classical statistics, which is great for pure science. Pure science, good. You know, you want to be able to reject null hypotheses and progress the science forward. But for applied science, those statistical methods are highly flawed, and you're better to use Bayesian approaches, and you're better to include economics in your decision making. The best kinds of actual applied science is when you do the science, the management and the monitoring together, and that's called active adaptive management. We have some papers on it. I strongly recommend anybody who has ever read The Ecological Detective by Hilborn and Mangle talks to you about how do you combine gathering evidence, research and monitoring. It's probably the most important applied ecology book in the world. Hilborn and Mangle, The Ecological Detective. And that tells you how to do the combination of monitoring and action together and do proper active adaptive management, which we all talk about, we never really do. And it's basically a trade-off between getting outcomes now, but also monitoring to slowly adapt your management activities. And there's an optimal way of doing that. I won't go through all of these, but I might just pick a couple because we've talked about spatial planning. This is an example by Hedley Grantham from South Africa. We talked a bit about spatial planning and Marxan and where do you put protected areas. One thing that often people say is we need to know more about where all the species are. More and more and more about where all the species are. So we actually looked at, this is South Africa. This is an area in the Cape, the Fynbos, which has the most biodiverse flora in the entire planet. I think they have 9,000 endemic plants in an area about the quarter of the size of Chile, or half the size of Chile, 9,000 endemic plants. And people kept saying, we're going to build a reserve system. When you build a reserve system, you look at the distribution of lots of species. There's hundreds of species of proteas. And they said, we need more and more data. They had 4,000 plots where they counted all the proteas. 4,000, and they had them distributed over the entire region, and they used that to build species distribution models. We found that, in fact, they already had more than enough data. And if they delayed making more reserves to wait for more data, they would lose habitat and lose more species than if they made the reserves with the limited data they had. Okay? So that's the other impact of science. If you say, we're not going to do actions on the ground until we know more, then you lose things while you're not acting. And in fact, they only needed 1,000 plots to make a very good decision. With 1,000 plots, their decision was 98% perfect. Knowing more and more and more was only going to move them slightly further along the curve of perfect actions. Anyway, we have a whole series of papers about how do you optimally monitor to deliver management outcomes. Again, most of the scientists will say, let's just get more data, because more data is always good. But if it comes at the cost of money or time, so time is really important. If you delay a decision because you want more data, then that's bad for the environment. When does that often happen? So the government wants to, you're worried about a mine, or you're worried about logging activities, you're worried about development. What often happens is the scientists will say, I'm worried about this mine. I think there's problems here. I've detected heavy metals, there's sedimentation going on, it's affecting the marine environment. What has often happened is you as a scientist, the government says, well, I think we need more data. Here's $1 million. Spend 3 years doing more research. And we buy it. We say, yeah, I get $1 million. I'll do more research and I'll prove what I already know with even more accuracy. What should really happen is the mining company should stop and prove they're not doing any damage. And once they've proved they're not doing damage, then they can start again. Why do we have to prove they're doing damage? Which gets back to the type 1 and 2 errors. Okay, so I think I've said many of these things. Basic research is absolutely essential, but if you're working like we were for the Nature Conservancy or for government, then you can't afford to do it. It generally has to happen in universities. This question about how much monitoring and research you should do is a decision science problem that I don't think economists have really spent a lot of time looking at. And so we need more research on that. When we're taught statistics, we're taught about null hypotheses and type 1 and type 2 areas, and a whole heap of statistical tests that are incredibly impossible to understand, that statistics is not that useful for applied scientists. It's not that useful for applied scientists. I have ignored a couple of things. For example, doing research on one problem, like the first example I said, let's save this threatened plant, the 2 management activities. Doing research on one problem may actually give you knowledge for another problem. Okay, so I didn't account for that. So there are benefits for studying particular threatened plant species, because once you've done the study, that could be transferred to another threatened plant species. So the value of knowledge can often be more generic than the particular problem you're dealing with. One thing I haven't talked much about is sometimes research has a negative impact on species. So I know my friends Mick McCarthy and Kirsten Paris, they were looking at how people studied survivorship in frogs and lizards, herpetologists. And herpetologists often tag particularly frogs by clipping their fingers and toes. They chop them, the tip off. And you've got 20 of them, right? So I can come along, I can grab Barbara and I can take the top of that toe, the second toe on the right foot and the third finger on the left hand. Then I come back and I know whether I can find Barbara again, because she's missing these 2 digits. And you can actually tag then thousands of individuals, because when you try and put markers on them with amphibians, they don't stay on and all these other things. What do you think that does? You're studying mortality rates in rare and threatened. They found by analysing the data that for every digit you lost, your mortality went up 10% over the next year. You're a frog and a reptile, you've lost some digits, and you're going to get infected and get bacterial infections, and you're probably going to die. Well, a slightly higher chance of dying. So sometimes, let's be honest, you cannot study a rare and threatened species without having some negative impact. Some negative impact. Once you catch it, stresses it, all these things. So you've got to be really sure that your science is going to deliver a bigger positive outcome than the negative outcome you delivered. That's an even less popular talk for people who actually catch animals. And any movement, to be honest, they've done studies, bird watchers going to a reserve impact the abundance of predators in those reserves, just watching birds, walking around. There's studies, repeated studies, particularly big predators hate people and their abundance disappears in the reserves. Not for every conservation problem. So I'll end with that. And I suppose all I want to do in this talk is implore you to ask the really difficult question. If you care about conservation, you care about delivering outcomes for nature, and then people say we need more monitoring and need more research, just simply say why. And they need to give you some reason, and then they need to say that that research is going to deliver enough information to make a better outcome for what you're trying to do in the long run. So they have to deliver more than they're taking. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Hugh. We're going to take some questions from the public. We have a hand here who can translate himself. Él se puede traducir a sí mismo.
I can do it in British, Australian, or American accents. No, so I will say the question in English and then in Spanish. So thanks, Hugh, for the presentation. It was great. I have a couple of colleagues that they won't be happy when I send the video to them, so they can watch the presentation. And for us, it's really useful. We have a project with Stefan in Patagonia, and we have dealt with some kind of these problems. Right. Because we are working in a marine protected area. Right. They don't have any information. They have to make decisions. A classical problem. And some scientists, they want more money to do monitoring. And we don't know exactly for what, and that's the big question. So any of these things are really useful for us to start some new conversation with the government and try to think which is the best way to go. So I have just one short question. It's important for us that maybe I can read the paper, but you are here now. So I like the approach to the value of information to evaluate when we need more data.
Yeah.
But sometimes we have a lot of uncertainty, so we don't have any information or really few information.
Yeah.
So really, how much information you need to do that kind of approach of value information?
Oh, yes, yeah. If you're really at rock bottom. I mean, yeah, so let's say you are just trying to conserve a species and you don't even know where it is, then, you know, yes, you need to find some individuals. I think, well, so yes, you need people in the field, and often they see things in the field about the species you need to speak. So I think early on, when there's almost no information, there's a lot of this going on. There's a lot of serendipity. And so there is somewhat, in some sense, there's no substitute for a human being in a location where in an ecosystem that's under stress, or where a species is in trouble, spending time in that location. And they may be doing things that appear to be fairly pure, but they see things. They see things that are unexpected, particularly with species that are very cryptic or locations that are very remote. So, for example, with marine protected areas, I often say, you don't really need any data. You can do a couple of things. You can look at water temperature. You can look at chlorophyll A from satellites. You can look at depth, and you can get bottom type, and you can get 4 or 5 parameters, and you can just stratify a whole marine system on 4 or 5 parameters and say, we'll build a reserve system. Now that really is very upsetting to a marine ecologist. I say, you mean you don't know where, you don't have any information about fish or shellfish, or you know nothing about this system. You're just purely taking remote data. So in those cases, I would say, build a reserve system of just 10% of all these different kinds of ecosystems based on this remote data, because then you're saving the building blocks. So water, we know that depth is important for marine organisms. We know water temperature, we know chlorophyll A. These are really, get a bit of everything, all the different biophysical drivers of life, conserve a representative sample of them, then over the next 5 or 10 years, send in the biologists, and they'll find things that the remote data didn't find, right? They'll find many things, and they'll say, and then add on later. But don't allow it to stop you doing something at the start. I think that's my advice. It's sort of a bit of a version of adaptive management. It's not quite. The good thing about marine reserves is you can move their boundaries much more easily than terrestrial reserves. If you put in terrestrial reserves, you end up with fences and ownership issues, and somebody's logging and not logging. In the marine world, if you do have to change the boundaries 10 or 20 years later, they can be done reasonably. Well, it's difficult, but it's not impossible. So you can be more adaptive in marine protected areas, I think.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important just to get something done. When the government's saying build me a marine reserve system, the worst thing that could happen is that all the ecologists saying, no, we need to collect data for 10 more years. And in that time, 20 salmon farms appear, and there's more fisheries, and there's other impacts from other systems. And you've just lost a lot of opportunities. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Para resumir, Rodrigo preguntó que él encontró que era muy útil la presentación para su trabajo aplicado en Patagonia con Stefan, donde están trabajando en áreas marinas protegidas, donde hay muy poquita información. Entonces preguntaba cuál es un poco el trade-off entre ir a buscar información con este tipo de aproximaciones. Entonces Hugh decía que una aproximación, por ejemplo, era estos mapas de percepción remota de hábitat, por ejemplo, para poder determinar, por ejemplo, el 10% de conservar cada uno de esos hábitats, y de esa manera determinar áreas marinas protegidas y no detener un proyecto de conservación por 10 años para ir a buscar los datos ecológicos más finos. No sé si sí, más o menos. Ahí. Mi nuevo trabajo será traductora. Otra pregunta? Another question? ¿Otra pregunta? No sean tímidos.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed the talk. Well, it's a comment and I want your thoughts on this. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is, yeah, you showed the value of information, ABCs, and I totally agree that when we don't need information, we can act, and let's act. What's interesting in terms of the value of information, though, is that probably all those lines are not linear lines.
Yeah.
They're all thresholds. And that, I think, is really interesting, because if we knew how close we were to thresholds, all our decisions sort of change. And I think that's something, at least from more of the economic side, we haven't really explored. You mentioned a little bit like how we value stuff, or the value of discount rates are sort of implicit there. But if we don't know how close or far we are from a threshold, that really can change things quite a lot. All I know about it a little bit is a bit on prospect theory and how close or far we are from being winners and losers makes our decisions as society now really flip. So I think that's a really nice scope there.
So what you're saying is, what I didn't do here is say what's enough. So this is the benefit. This might be the growth rate of the population. So if this is the growth, what you really want to know is where is the population not growing?
Yeah.
And if that line is sort of here, you know, somewhere in the middle there, then you want to be sure that what you're doing is pushing you above that threshold.
Exactly.
There's thresholds in ecology, and of course there's thresholds in social systems and economic systems, which we understand. At least in ecology we know if a mother has more babies and that become mothers than herself, then the species should prosper. And socially, there's some maths around it. Population viability, life tables. With social systems, of course, exactly when a community is close to a threshold of persisting or not is highly uncertain. And so that's why I think what I would say is do things, and I think there's always value in some form of evaluation of interventions, even if they're very simple evaluations. So Madeline Bottrell was one of my students, a brilliant student who ended up working for Vulcan and Moore and all those companies. She evaluated 45, I think, conservation activities in Samoa. And she found out in the end only 3 had enough data to say anything. So in Samoa, lots of little projects. They usually lasted 2 to 5 years. After 10 years, only 3 of them even had any data, and none had enough data to say whether they'd worked or not. So that's sort of saying, in general, in small projects and small NGOs, we're just not doing enough evaluation at all. And if we are, we're not telling everybody what we've done, and then nobody can really learn from any of those examples. The money was spent, the trees were planted, something happened, but nobody really knows whether we delivered the outcome we want. So in some senses, evaluation is a better term. Evaluation is just monitoring, but it's sort of like, it's like an auditing. It's like that first thing. It's like an auditing of the books. You know, somebody gave me $500,000 to deliver an outcome. At some point at the end of the process, somebody should check whether that fox is increased in abundance, whether that rare plant is safe or not. And that usually doesn't happen. It's scary, very scary. That's right. So I'm giving such long answers. Maria has no hope. No hope.
You have to look at the YouTube. Someone has another question? I have a question. I have a question, Hugh. You were saying that the value of information analysis have not been used much in conservation science. So I wanted to ask you, like, if you can give some recommendations, or how can we better integrate this theory, this value information theory, to be more effectively used in conservation science to assess and determine expected benefits in
so there's some good papers. There's some good
I'm going
papers.
to translate. So I can,
they're good papers, but the problem is the value of information analysis. These papers all do them themselves, costing a lot of money. So what's the value of a value of information analysis. So what we need is shortcuts. We need simple rules of thumb to do a value of information quickly, and we don't actually even have that. So we don't have it. But I would say somebody wants to do some science on a conservation issue, just saying, tell me a story about how your science will change what I do. So there's got a verbal theory of change. And then try and work out some quick way around a table with half a dozen experts is how much of a difference is this a game changer? Is this going to save the species? Is that got a 50% chance of doing that? Then it's probably worth doing. But so I think you can if you think about value of information theory and you think about these three questions here, these three questions are the three questions. You can do it with smart people around a room. Realistically, are there multiple options? What's the chance the research will work, and what's the chance the research could actually change what we do because we'll find a better way of doing it? And then what's the chance that there will be a huge difference to the species or the ecosystem? And at least you've got to go. It's like asking three critical questions. Yeah. I think there was a question back there.
So I'm going to translate a little bit. Yo pregunté que vemos que esta teoría del valor de la información se ha usado muy poquito en la ciencia de conservación, entonces le pregunté si había algunas recomendaciones que podríamos hacer para más efectivamente integrarlo y evaluar estrategias de conservación. Y me decía Hugh que tenía muchos papers donde han dado varias recomendaciones, va a quedar grabado así que los pueden revisar nuevamente, pero una buena opción, expert elicitation maybe, juntar a expertos y hacer algunas preguntas y tomar atención, okay, cuáles son las opciones que tenemos, lo que será acá. ¿Cuál es la probabilidad de que la investigación cambie nuestros resultados y el beneficio esperado de esas alternativas de manejo? ¿Tenemos otra pregunta? Another question?
Hello, Hugh.
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation. I have one question about the impact in conservation or restoration on any project related. This monitoring is about when we are working in the project on where we are establishing the basis to make decisions. But because we need to know which is the impact of our actions or the conservation project. So we had to make another monitoring plan for that, create indicators, but my question is when we should stop. When we know that the species is safe or the ecosystem is better, when we are out of danger?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's another very difficult question. This is a paper by Helen Regan, I think from 2006, where we were trying to work out when do you know you've eradicated a pest? So you have an area or a country or a region and there's a pest, an invasive species. So we did all the maths about how after you think you've killed them all and you can't find any, how many years do you wait? How many years do you keep going back to check? Because some pests are cryptic, so they could have seeds in the seed bank or they could be difficult to find. So yes, that is possible to answer that question, but you need to do everything's how long you should keep monitoring and acting. It's actually, you have to work it out for every problem. We don't have a simple rule of thumb. Well, we sort of came up with a bit of rule of problem, that problem. This was an interesting one by Iadine Chades. This is a PNAS paper where, for example, we looked at tigers in Sumatra. So tigers are in decline in Sumatra, tigers are in decline in many places, and there are a couple of big national parks. And the question was, they could do 2 or 3 things. They could have poaching patrols, lots of people, or they could set up a big camera trap monitoring system, or they could do a bit of both. And it was interesting, what we found is even if, the question is, when would you stop the poaching patrols because you thought the tiger had gone extinct, which is sort of the reverse question to your question, is when do you save it? We found that even if you had not seen a tiger for 20 years, you would still have anti-poaching patrols because it was still useful to do it. So, and then after 20 years, then you'd invest in a lot of monitoring, and then you'd finally prove they're gone, and then you'd stop the anti-poaching patrols. So there's a lot of interesting counterintuitive results in these circumstances, and so we don't have a simple answer. Every problem is different, unfortunately, which makes things tough, right? Often, though, I can say in Australia, which, like Chile, has a lot of invasive species problems, when we're trying to wipe something out, an invasive species, we usually walk away too soon. So we think we've wiped it out, the funding goes away, nobody can see any, and then we stop looking and government says done, and then 5 years later we come back and suddenly there's 1,000 of them and it's worse than it ever was before. So usually we stop post-intervention evaluations too soon.
Thank you. And I'm not going to translate because it's coffee time.
That's good.
So I can, if I can answer in the coffee break, so we can have go out and have some coffee. And thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna just thank you, Hugh, for your great talk. Hugh did also a great talk on Tuesday at Universidad de Talca, sede Santiago. It's also in YouTube, in the Institute of Ecology and Biodiversity. Entonces, digo que todo esto quedó grabado. Muy bien. Muchas gracias, Nelson. Muchas gracias, Instituto de Ecología y Biodiversidad. En el YouTube del IEB lo pueden volver a ver, practicar su inglés. Cualquier cosa también están todos nuestros contactos. Y muchas gracias a nuestros invitados magistrales, a Jen, a Hugh por haber venido de tan lejos, Jen de Los Ángeles, California, Hugh de Brisbane, Australia, a contarnos algunas historias muy interesantes de ciencia política, de cómo hacer ciencia más aplicada y de ocupar teoría de la decisión en nuestros problemas de conservación, que tenemos muchos. Así que muchas gracias a todos, le damos un aplauso. Hugh said that you can text him anytime, anytime of the day. Anytime he will answer.
My phone's always on silent.
He won't answer, but yeah, it's not his number. But you can text him anytime, and we have some coffee.
Thank you. Well done. Good job.
I'll give you the wine afterwards.